The acclaimed exhibition, Young America, the Daguerreotypes of Southworth and Hawes, currently on view at the Addison Gallery of American Art at Phillips Academy in Andover, offers an unparalleled opportunity to view 150 perfectly illuminated images created by the famous Boston partnership of Albert Sands Southworth and Josiah Johnson Hawes. The Boston Athenaeum is very pleased to have a few of our examples included in this pioneering exhibition. And I want to extend an invitation to you because the Athenaeum is going to take a visit to the Addison Gallery. We'll have a bus take us from Boston up to Andover on April 6th. We'll have a gallery tour that will be led by Sally Pierce, our curator of photographs. And if you're interested, I ask that after the lecture this evening, you talk to Monica Higgins and let her know that you'd like to join us. This evening, Grant Romer, curator of the exhibition and author of the lead essay in the catalog, and what a catalog it is, will show us how new research has revealed that the architecture of the renowned Tremont Row studio played a highly significant role in the development of the distinctive style of their famous partnership. Grant Romer is director of the Advanced Residency Program in Photograph Conservation at the George Eastman House, International Museum of Photography and Film in Rochester, New York. A conservator of international reputation, he has made daguerreotypes himself, and he is unsurpassed as an after-dinner speaker at Daguerrean Society events. I'm one of the few people in this room who also knows that Grant Romer served as the photographic advisor to Steven Spielberg as he made his film Amistad in 1997, and that he appears in the film for 1 nanosecond as the daguerreotyper, half a nanosecond. This evening he's going to talk to us about the artist's daguerreotype rooms, so please join me in welcoming my dear friend Grant Romer to the Boston Athenaeum.
Well, you often hear speakers say it's a pleasure to be here, but in this case it's a whole concert of pleasures for me to be here. On so many different levels. I have so many friends and associations with the Athenaeum and the history of photography in Boston. And even I remember my first trip to Boston in 1952 with my grandmother and grandfather, which still lingers very strongly in my head. So just being back in Boston for another pleasure is not enough to simply say, I'm very happy to be here. I'm truly delighted. The occasion of being the curator for the exhibition Young America, the Daguerreotypes of Southworth and Hawes, if I learned anything, it's that the surviving work of Southworth and Hawes is truly one of our great national treasures and is yet to be fully appreciated as such. We are just reaching the point where we are able to have a perspective on the first era of photography, the first 20 years of photography in the world, that begins to show that it was a very special moment in history, the history of the world, the history of every country in the world, and our own individual history. So much of what we know, so much of our world, so much of our consciousness is now dependent on photography that it's very hard to say where it begins and where it ends. But there indeed was a time when it didn't exist, and it wasn't that long ago, a little more than 150 years, and if you multiply me 3 times, that makes 150 years and more. So I can now understand it's not a lot of time at all. The period 1840 to 1860 is the period when the photographic invention found its first iteration in society and its first iteration in our society. And that period 1840 to 1860, was characterized then as the Young America period. We have lost our consciousness and memory of when the country was not represented by Uncle Sam, but was represented by a young boy with a big club who was called Young America. The country saw itself as a youthful giant, not yet mature, not yet fully grown, but full of potential energy and self-reliant in the extreme. It saw itself as the great nation of futurity, and no less a figure than Abraham Lincoln said, "Young America, the inventor and owner of the present, and the only hope of the future in this era." You never hear that quote from Lincoln, do you? But it's, I think, still said. I hear it on television all the time in one way or the other. We still believe that we have a special relationship with the present and that we are the hope of the future. At least some of us do. This consciousness dawned in the period of early 1840s, when the country was still in the process of expanding, had not yet come to the richness that it was like to have by the end of this 20-year period up until 1860. And I think it's very important to start out with that consciousness, that it was a very special time for the nation. And so, lights please, let me give you at least pictures to go with my words. The exhibition that Richard mentioned is certainly well worth going to see, not because I am the curator of it by any means. I'm merely the implement of getting it up on the wall. I believe that a random selection of the approximately 2,500 daguerreotypes that we are able to locate from the studio of Southworth and Hawes, a random selection alone of 150 of their daguerreotypes would be amongst the most interesting, rare, and spectacular opportunities to understand something not only of the period, 1840 to 1860, not only of photography in America, but of really two of the most unusual and perhaps most special of the over 10,000 daguerreotypists that worked in the United States. Just the opportunity to see 150 daguerreotypes well lit is itself something you're not going to have the opportunity probably again for another 20 or 30 years. So I do recommend it to you for that reason alone. But I do want to start out with bringing your consciousness to the fact that the country in 1839, when in September of 1839 the news reached the United States that there was finally the means to make by the action of chemistry an image produced by the lens, what we call photography. The country that we know today was still in the process of formation. Texas had not been annexed. The war with Mexico had not been fought. The nation had not reached the shores of the Pacific. The borders with Canada had not been totally settled. The country was still not yet at its full manifest destiny. And indeed, this is also the period when that concept of the manifest destiny of the country developed. In 1839, there was probably no figure that represented to the world, no living figure, the nature of America than Daniel Webster, who was universally admired in the world as the epitome of the American Yankee. And he was the first orator in the nation at a time when being the first orator was equivalent to being the best music star in the country. Far away, one of the most admired abilities that you could have in the culture of the time was to be able to speak and speak convincingly, and no figure was greater than Daniel Webster at that time. In 1839, Thomas Carlyle saw Webster when he was in England, and he described him thus: "Not many days ago, I saw at breakfast the notablest of your notabilities, Daniel Webster. He is a magnificent specimen. You might say to all the world, this is your Yankee Englishman. Such limbs we make in Yankee land. As a logic fencer or parliamentary Hercules, one would be inclined to back him at first sight against all the extant world. The tanned complexion, the amorphous crag-like face, the dull black eyes, under the precipice of brows like dull anthracite furnaces, needing only to be blown, the mastiff mouth accurately closed. I have not traced so much silent berserker rage that I remember in any man. Well, Carlyle was good at painting a portrait with words, and that portrait of Webster does correspond to some extent with the many artistic representations that we have of Webster. This painting by George Healy of about 1845 of Webster, and indeed Webster is a figure that the Athenaeum knows well. He greets you as you come in the door. I've seen his visage at least 3 times during the course of my walk around the Athenaeum. No matter, however, how great a painting or a sculpture of Webster might be, it does not do what photography does in representing the living reality of the man. We have become dull to the miracle of photography and rarely step back and relish the unusual nature of this technology, which is essentially a form of time technology. It allows you to go back in time pretty convincingly to a visual reality at a certain moment, in this case 160 or more years removed from this very moment. And yet we have the ability to look at the actuality of Daniel Webster in 3-dimensional space with light and air and heartbeat and sentient movement of his mind. Photography is different than sculpture and painting, and it has special qualities. They're not necessarily in every way preferable to sculpture and painting, but it's this miracle of photography that we have become dulled to, that when it hit America in 1839 was responded to with a vigor that was unparalleled and really unusually strong in our nation, because it came at a moment of special conditions. A society that was still growing, a society that was self-confident, a society that had great potential, a society that was in economic turmoil, a society that was in political turmoil. One of the great claims of Daniel Webster to our eternal debt is his speaking for nationhood, the idea of the Union. We still resonate to some of the concepts that he brought forward. It was said of Webster that he had the soundest sense of the purpose of government. I've never heard that said about anybody. Right? A sound sense of the purpose of government. And I do believe he is well worth remembering. But a painting and a sculpture, as I said, no matter how it might glorify the individual, does not do what the photograph does. These are daguerreotypes, by the way, of Daniel Webster, made by Southworth and Hawes, no more than a block and a half away from this very site, at the end of his life, just about in the last year of his life. And when we look at this face and go back to Carlyle's description of him, quite simply as saying, the amorphous crag-like face, the dull black eyes under the precipice of brows, like dull anthracite furnaces needing only to be blown, the mastiff mouth accurately closed, I have not traced so much silent berserker rage that I remember in any man. Well, you can believe it. You can believe it. This image was made in Boston, and Boston has a great claim to a special place in the history of this country in photography and has been the home of many, many great photographers, past, present, and I dare say it will be so in the future as well. This institution has done much to preserve the heritage of Boston and its photographic heritage in particular. And I'm going to talk a little bit, not so much about Southworth and Hawes, but Southworth and Hawes in Boston. Something about Boston helped Southworth and Hawes to make the achievement that they made. And I come from New York City, and New York City is not Boston. There is a relationship, but it's not the same. But I've come to know Boston largely through this project, and I am going to speak with you who are intimates and far more knowledgeable, perhaps, than I am about Boston, but to give you some insight as to how somebody outside Boston sees Boston and thinks about Boston and has discovered things about Boston that perhaps you yourself might not. This is the masthead of Gleason's Pictorial, the illustrated magazine of the 1840s and 50s, and it shows Boston as it appeared from the harbor, literally very much as the Athens of America, which it claimed to be. The State House, like the Parthenon on its height, the city sloping down towards the very edge of the water, in which the vitality of the harbor, in which the more barrels delivered to Boston by ships, the more Boston was described by Emerson in his account of what drove the city in this period. It was a great city of commerce. That city is still there, but at first sight to somebody who's never seen it, it's invisible. Right? There it is at the bottom of those big boxes that really have changed the whole scale of Boston and has done much to obliterate what was perhaps one of the most beautiful sights for a city in the United States and was described by Dickens as the most beautiful city in the United States upon his visit in the 1840s. You know the city of Boston very well and where it began and more or less ended in this period of 1840. The population of Boston was no more than 50,000 people. It was relatively a small village compared to what it is today. And in this environment, in which you know again very well, this map shows you, of course, it's no problem for you to locate yourself, the Athenaeum on the other side of the burial ground on Beacon Street. But it is at this central part of Boston, what for all intents and purposes is, let's say, the Agora of Athens, that we begin with the story of how photography found its way into the city. In 1839, when the news of photography came to Boston, the last of the three mountains, why you say Tremont Street, it's Tremonti, right? You all know that. There were three hills, and they were all relatively low compared to real mountains, but they had to be reduced. And the last of them had been in the process of being reduced here in what today, where the courthouse in Pemberton Square, here's Tremont Street, and here is Scollay Square. It had just been reduced, and in the early 1840s was developed with a court of high-end residences and a row of commercial buildings that came to be known as Tremont Row. At this time, still, the rise in the center of the street, there was a little bit of a hill there in which they had cut away the hill so that you could turn carts around that big hump. On that big hump was built the Scollay Building, from whence the square has its name, Scollay Square. The buildings that were here was where, and again a little bit of a orientation, here's Faneuil Hall, Quincy Market, the slope down the hill, down Cord Hill, Brattle Hill. Here is where the Civic Center, government buildings are now. It was this development of Pemberton Square and the courtyard here, and this building, which was then the Scollay Building, where Albert Sands Southworth in 1851 established his first daguerreotype studio in Boston. Here's the ad from 1841 that declares that daguerreotype miniature rooms at 60.5 Court Street or 61 Tremont Row, and he claims the first establishment in New England for the making of photographic miniatures. I'm not going to give you a full history of who made the first daguerreotypes, but lectures were given here in early 1840 in the Masonic Hall by a Frenchman, and from that moment on, a number of people went into the business. John Plumb opened a studio very early. Southworth went into business, but he went into business in Cabottville, which is now Chicopee, Massachusetts. But he made enough progress that in early 1841 he moved to Boston to try to get the business to support his hope of making a fortune in photography. Here's the Scollay Building, which, by the way, was once the home of the Boston Athenaeum for a while. This site was an area in which artists had, from colonial days, had their studios in the general area of Scollay Square. And this building, which looks very modest by comparison with grander buildings, was the site of many, many cultural activities from the time of its building in the early probably 20s in its original form. And in this building, Southworth established his studio. Here we have a view the other way around. This is the end of Tremont Street. Here is Scollay Square. Here, roughly where the entrance to the subway is today, is where the Scollay Building once stood. And you can see here in the top of the building some skylights where possibly Southworth operated for a while. He positioned the studio to be there, not so much because it was at the end of Tremont Street, but because it was at the opening to Pemberton Square. The people who were living in Pemberton Square, no less personages than the Lawrences, were the people he wanted to get the patronage of. So he put them himself right at the door of the elite of Boston, and very rapidly found that he got their business. And he made a specialty from the very beginning of making the best for the best. This was his avowed statement from the very beginning, the earliest writings that he made about his concept of what he wanted to do in the daguerreotype. And there was no better location in Boston for that to be done. It is also at a historical center of the city. You accept history as abundantly present in Boston. You have a great consciousness of it. But so much history, so much important history in such a concentrated area. There are few cities that so clearly can, at even this point in 1840, look back on the last 100 years of their history and have so much pride in what it meant to the formation of the nation. I'm not going to talk to you about who was just a block away in every direction, but an amazing array of personages. Here's Scollay Square at the time of approximately the late 1860s when the building was removed, and it gives you an idea of the architectural space. And Southworth was so successful in 1840 and 41 that he looked upon the new row of buildings that were higher up, and let me just go back and point out that this view of the Scollay Building is made from the buildings, the newly developed buildings on Tremont Row that were higher and looked down upon but had a better view of the harbor and had more light available to them than being higher up on the hill in which this building itself fell into the shadow of these buildings. And Southworth, as soon as this row was completed, decided upon moving his studio up into 3 of those buildings. Here is a later insurance map of that area. And you see these three buildings belonging to the Lawrences, by the way. It had been newly developed. This group of three buildings was rented. The loft spaces were rented to Southworth, and he took in a new partner into the business at the time that he moved. Here is 5.5 Tremont Row. The entrance was here, 5.5, underneath the giant molar. This block also was, besides the home of many artists, sculptors, and painters, was the central area for the dental business, which was a new business in which Boston also pioneered in many, many ways, the firsts. And indeed, the first use of anesthesia was applied by a dentist who was working in this row of buildings here in the United States. Anyway, there's the entrance to the studio. There's the street-level signboard. Never did they have a sign that said Southworth and Hawes. There perhaps was something up over the transom, but there was nothing more than this street-level sign. But you went up, you went over, you went up a circular stairway up into this room's where they had their gallery display, and then in the loft spaces of these three buildings is their operating rooms. Here, at the turn of the century, is a panoramic view looking down at Tremont Row, and it shows a number of other skylights that had been developed as the row filled up with photographers later on in the 19th century. But here you have, in this area here, we have the sign J. Henry Norcross. This is the studio of Southworth and Hawes, and here most distinctively in their rooms is their skylight. Southworth claimed that he had the first skylight installed for the use of photography in America. It's an amazing claim, but it's quite a believable claim. Most daguerreotypists, when they started out, were challenged to make exposures fast enough to apply for portraiture. They used as big a window as possible, but the profit margin for the business was so small that they had to make do with existing rooms wherever they were in the buildings, often rented for a short time for making daguerreotypes. It was Southworth move into this building in which he contracted with the owner to build this very large flat skylight, approximately 10 by 15, that gave him enough light to be able to make shorter exposures and artistically better compositions from the standpoint of the light alone. It's a long explanation exactly how we have figured out, through a combination of reference to the insurance maps and various other clues. We now know that this is what was called the taking room. It was 21 feet wide by about 35 feet long, with quite a large skylight in it. And all of the daguerreotypes of Southworth and Hawes that you see were made in this room. The other rooms were used for the storage of apparatus and the dark room and sensitizing facilities. Here in this daguerreotype, stereo daguerreotype made in those rooms, we now know very clearly where that is. You can sense that there's a large skylight up above, and you can see that the skylight gives you overhead light. Most of the light in the 19th century that you see in photographic studios is side light. It's angled side light. Overhead light is a difficult light to work in, and Southworth said so. He said they did the best that they could with the light that they had. Well, they did it very, very good with the light that they had. But it is part of why they have the distinctive look that they do. The architecture, the space, the place, are all highly significant in the aesthetic that Southworth and Hawes developed and in the beauty of the work that is so much admired today. We now know this is the window looking towards Brattle Street, down towards the harbor. This room, and if I go back, I can show you. They had sealed off the front rooms to make dressing rooms for ladies. Ladies would not go into the studio without escort. The family situation of the Southworth and Hawes studio was enhanced by making these special rooms where you could dress. And so we can reconstruct very much factors of the architecture that tell us when we see the image exactly where they are. And remarkably about the work of Southworth and Hawes is that not only did they move the sitter around in the studio, but they moved around the sitter. When you see the exhibition in Andover, look and see how varied their work is and understand that that was no small achievement. Every time you're moving the sitter, the exposure changes, the aesthetic changes. They took as long as 2.5 hours at every sitting, which was not a way to make money. And although they made 4 exposures in the course of 2 hours, they weren't always successful exposures. And so this extraordinary development of a working method to try to make the best for the best was very much dependent upon the studio as a tool, and they really were dynamically moving around in that studio. I'm not here to explain that at great length, but I will explain to you how we've been able to reconstruct certain things about the history of the building. Southworth and Hawes were in partnership from 1843 to 1863. When the partnership dissolved, Hawes stayed in the studio until 1901. Over 50 years working in the same studio. He preserved the studio very much as it had been in the Daguerreotype era, and the children of Hawes, he was married to Southworth's sister. The children grew up in the studio with the consciousness of the legacy of their father, their uncle, and their mother, because the mother worked in the business, and the understanding that the elite of Boston society were depicted in the daguerreotypes that they retained in the studio. And therefore, when Hawes died, they put the contents of the studio into storage. When the 3 children came to the end of their life in the 1930s, none of them had married, they had no heir, they began to be concerned about the legacy that they had maintained, and they saw to it that it went to caretakership. 200 daguerreotypes, for instance, were given to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Other daguerreotypes found their way into the families of Boston. 100 daguerreotypes were bought by a New York collector and given to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And a collector of Americana bought what remained, approximately 1,200 daguerreotypes and 2,000 pieces of their business correspondence, and gave it to the George Eastman House, the newly established museum that served really to be the museum of the history of photography for the world. Through their caretakership, we have their imagery, but at the end of the life of Josiah Hawes' son, Edward, he was visited by a young man from California who was a historian, an amateur historian of photography, who asked him to draw the studio for him. And he preserved this drawing, which he gave to Beaumont Newhall in 1951. And from this drawing, made by the son of Hawes, we have been able to architecturally make a map of the studio itself. So we have been able to reconstruct from a number of different sources the architecture and the footprint of the studio. We understand that the entry to the studio was with a circular stairway up. We have actually a computer model that would allow you to have the experience of entering the building at the ground floor and working your way all the way up until the top. Now, why bother to do this? We bother to do this because Southworth and Hawes, from the very beginning of their work, considered themselves not photographers, but artists. Now, there are many people walking around today who are photographers who don't call themselves photographers. They call themselves artists. And there were many people in the era of the beginning of the daguerreotype where they call themselves Daguerrean artists. But Southworth and Hawes never called themselves such. They referred to themselves as artists working in the daguerreotype. And You can claim that, that's one thing, but they did that as well. And when we look at their work, we have to look at it with all of the focus and all of the appreciation that you would give to understanding the working methods of great painters or great sculptors. And indeed, you can do that for Southworth and Hawes. Here's their ad when they entered the Tremont Row studio, and it was just a depiction at the very top, that little bit of graphic where the sun is painting the portrait of the earth. That sends that message, really, that it's not a camera that's being depicted there, but it's an easel and painting that is going on. How Southworth and Hawes came to think of themselves as artists, and how did they become artists, is one of the most fascinating questions, really, to raise. It's one thing to say they're artists, but how did two men born on the farm in New England come to develop a sophistication that made it possible for them to make some of the most timeless masterpieces in photography that have ever been or ever will be made? 1840 in the United States, we were never further away from European influence in this period, 1840 to 1850. If I ask you to name the great portrait painters in America in that period, some people here could do it, perhaps, but there are not many great ones. They're not the names that are on everyone's lips. You can talk about Trumbull or a number of other people before. You can talk about Sargent after. But what happens in this period, 1840 and 1850, I would put forward to you, is that the great genius of America in the arts, at least in terms of the pictorial arts, moved into the house of photography and made their achievement there. But they made that achievement on the basis of their own natural native talent. They did not have the Louvre or the wonders of London or Vienna or Berlin to learn from. Where did they go? What did they look at? Where did they see paintings? Where did they see sculpture? Where did they refer to graphic artworks to get their education? Southworth had a better education than Hawes. He went to Phillips Academy but did not graduate. He was working as a pharmacist at the time that he heard of the invention of the daguerreotype. Hawes was born on a farm, stayed on until the age of 17, was apprenticed to a carpenter, worked for 4 years as a carpenter, and one day when somebody showed him that if you block out the frame of a painting, it looks more three-dimensional, and he did that and saw the illusion of 3 dimensions, he decided he would be a painter and taught himself how to paint. I'm sure both of them read the lectures of Sir Joshua Reynolds, Opie, Fuseli, anything in English that served as a treatise for instruction, but reading about art and making it are not the same thing. What influenced them? How did they learn? How did they evolve this style that's so distinctive in their work is a very important question for us to answer. Most daguerreotypes are the ancestor of our driving license picture, right? If not your driving license, your passport photo. They are rather matter-of-fact, less than complimentary, somewhat simple and primitive, at least most of them. There are exceptions to the case, but most of them aspired to be a little bit more than a factual portrait of you as you are, not as you should be seen, not as you wanted to be seen, but as you are. And indeed, most of the lighting of the earliest daguerreotypes is very flat lighting. It's meant to show the features of the face, the eyes, the nose, the mouth. And people objected to shadows on the face, which they saw as blemishes. If you look at the tradition of portrait miniature painting, shadows are generally suppressed. It's Queen Elizabeth, Elizabeth, who said to her miniature painters, "I want no shadows on my face." And that memory of that and that tradition in the portrait miniature was still very much alive in the 1830s and 1840s in the average person's life. When they went to have their portrait made, they asked for a simple depiction. The work of Southworth and Hawes is distinctly different. The difference of these two pictures, they're both made in 1850. But the difference is a vision, a command, a concept, a mastery, an understanding of more than technology, an understanding of more than picture making, an understanding of humanity, what makes character, how character should be displayed, and how it can be done in such a way as to virtually transcend the time in which it's made, so that it is a living, palpable illusion of a real person in which time, the passage of time, is not an oppressive factor in the way in which you appreciate it. That is a remarkable achievement. Here again, the making of portraits of children were difficult. The child did not have the type of composure that an adult did not have the type of understanding of what was going on, facing that strange man with the box with your mother and father going, hold still, hold still, hold still. You can see in the expression of the younger child that this is not the most comforting of experiences. But in the work of Southworth and Hawes, made in the same period, what magical talent did they have to put children at ease and to compose them in such a fashion to have the type of charming depiction that is the type of picture that you would want to have in the long run, to reflect upon the beauty of the childhood moment. This is extraordinary work. By the end of the 19th century, this was all figured out. Portraiture, good quality photographic portraiture was made everywhere in the world. I defy you to go out and get as good a portrait of yourself made tomorrow in Boston, by the way. We have lost much of our general ability to be able to get high-quality photographic portraiture. But I recall to you the fact that this is in the very beginning, where there is no model in photography, and there's very few models in art that are going to serve the photographer, who's working in a very different medium than paint or stone, in the depiction of an individual. You could modify in painting and drawing, you can enhance and flatter, but in photography that is a little harder to do. And indeed in the daguerreotype, which does not allow for retouching, unlike the later forms of photography that allows for the retouching of the negative in print, the removal of blemishes, wrinkles, moles, shadows where they don't belong. The daguerreotype is a one-time exposure. It's all based upon managing the light, managing the composition, upside down, by the way, and understanding the process. That Southworth and Hawes came to have a style, this extremely beautiful, mellow, yet dramatic and pictorial type of depiction that just is amazing. These are the oldest of photographs, and yet they are amongst the freshest and most effective of photographs. I'm not showing you their greatest work. This is the type of work that's just the stuff that was passed over when the great selections were being made. We don't know who these people are. They're the smaller format portraits, but they do reflect a standard that's typical of their work and a style that's typical of their work. And again, I go back to that question, how did they come to evolve this style in no more than 6 years of working? Here's a quote, "No one is fit for a daguerreotypist or should presume to attempt the practice of the art who has not the genius for becoming, if not a preeminent, at least a highly respectable painter." Well, I believe in the case of both Southworth and Hawes, they had that native genius and potential. And they both recognized it, although that genius and potential was different in the both of them. Here again, daguerreotyping is an art. The claim here, very early, it's not mechanics. You just don't point the camera at somebody and take the picture and it comes out beautiful. It's an art, one that requires much study. The arrangement of the sitter for a daguerreotype likeness should be as carefully studied and as artistically made as though the image was to be chiseled in Italian marble or painted on a canvas. This was rare consciousness amongst the many people that made daguerreotypes as a profession, but it was a consciousness of the very highest end and the most ambitious who entered the profession. And both Southworth and Hawes understood this and worked accordingly. I believe Southworth had, as I told you, a better education and perhaps a more philosophical and intellectual approach to it. I think he's as much influenced in his thinking by critical philosophy. I believe, for instance, he probably read the work of Fichte, The Vocation of a Scholar, which advocates that the scholar is at the highest end of society and his obligation is to perfect it. Because over and over again in Southworth's writings, he uses this perfection, perfection, perfection. He was trying to make the most perfect daguerreotype humanly possible. And he was trying to make it for the betterment of society. He says so. Hawes is rather mute about what he's seeing and doing, but he is described by all those who knew and loved him as a lover of beauty and nature. It's quite interesting in this self-portrait here in which he's depicted in seemingly an alpine environment with a sprig of evergreen. This plant, by the way, was in the studio all the way until 1901. It shows up in the pictures all throughout the history of 50 years. He kept it alive. These two men had different sensibilities, but they came together in what may be the only true artistic collaboration in photography in perhaps the 19th century. It's not common that you hear of two people working together to make a common aesthetic body of work in photography. It's an individualist's medium. It is not a medium in which you can collaborate easily, and not in portraiture. But both of these men did, in the spirit, I believe, of the young America consciousness. They trusted themselves, they trusted their native talent, and they did the hard work, the study that was necessary. Daguerreotyping opens a wide field of study to those who adopt it as a profession. It is unlike nearly all other branches of fine arts, although intimately connected with them. There is no portion of the process that does not depend upon either chemistry, natural philosophy, painting, mechanics, or taste. Southworth and Hawes had it all. Between the both of them, they had the chemistry down, the natural philosophy down, the painting down, the mechanics down. They said Hawes could make anything if you showed him the model of it. And they had the taste. That they could create in 1852 a picture like this, that if it was a painting, would be admired today for what it was. In the daguerreotype, which is supposedly the most primitive of forms of photography, before lenses were perfected, cameras were perfected, before lighting, studio lighting by artificial means was possible, they were in complete command of process, complete understanding of what it could do, managed the camera superbly, composed everything here, and made just an absolute masterpiece by any standard of picture making. Of all things, a bride. How many bridal portraits do you see of the 1850s where you can recognize not only that it's a bridal dress, but a good one by contemporary standards? What a fortune this dress would cost today, right? Much less a portrait of that. Just made no more than 2 blocks away here in 1850 by 2 guys born on a farm. How do you make sense of that? Well, they certainly looked at everything they could. And indeed, in the collection of the Eastman House, we have a copy of a painting, daguerreotype made by them, in which the pose is very similar and very much, obviously, I think, it doesn't take any leap of imagination to say that in all likelihood this was the model for that. But just the model in composition, it does not work out. You just don't imitate that painting and it comes out that way. It's a much greater achievement to be able to render in the daguerreotype than it is to be able to render in paint or in charcoal. We know that they were in touch with Marcus Root. Marcus Aurelius Root was the foremost advocate for fine art applications of the daguerreotype, and he encouraged you to read as much, read Reynolds, look at paintings, look at prints, particularly look at prints. It's the graphic arts more than painting that was most comparable to the daguerreotype, it being basically monochromatic. And when you see in this case of Southworth and Hawes a composition like this, there is a good possibility it has some model in the graphic arts. And in this picture you actually see an example in which they're looking at a print. The portfolio is identifiable as the Women of Shakespeare. It's a little hard to see, but you can see this print in which the woman has her hands crossed like this in the print. I'm sorry I don't have it. The slide was not transferable. But here you can see they have borrowed the pose. But their work is remarkably free of such borrowing. It does not have a lot of this sort of tableau vivant, not a lot of this type of gesture. It's really very rare. They experimented, they tried. I think far more influential to them was their looking at sculpture. In that studio, with its large overhead lighting, very similar to what you see here, the overhead lighting coming down directly on casts of classical sculpture, basic to the education of any academically trained artist in the 19th century, in which the classic sculpture in copy form served as the basis for your first lessons in modeling and anatomy. Where would, of course, Southworth and Hawes be able to see such classical sculpture? Well, they saw it here. They saw it here. The Boston Athenaeum was a great supporter of American sculpture in this period, which was classicizing. They had a gallery. Am I not correct that there was a gallery of sculpture here in which the Apollo Belvedere, and indeed these are Southworth and Hawes daguerreotypes made in the gallery of the Boston Athenaeum. They studied those sculptures. Why do you need to take a picture of a sculpture? These are studies in which they are, very much as the artist draws from the model, that they are looking at the way in which light on form falls. When the Hiram Powers Greek slave was exhibited in Boston, they daguerreotyped that sculpture and in their studio projected it life-size and sold tickets to seeing life-size virtual reality sculpture. They were very, very, very conscious sculpturally. This has not been much talked about or understood in the analysis of their work. It is something that only dawned on me in the last 2 months, how really basic it is to the understanding of their work. More than painting, more than graphic arts, it's the sculptural arts, the three-dimensional arts, that is most influential in the development of their style. Where else did they see it? In Mount Auburn Cemetery. And it's the one place in Boston where you still can go and see what Southworth and Hawes saw. There's many, many monuments there that have sculpture. Here's the daguerreotype by Southworth and Hawes of an architect. There is still today. You can have the same experience. The beauty of going to Greenwood, of seeing not only architecture and sculpture in the natural environment, and it's not so natural, of course, it's carefully calculated to have a certain type of beauty. They made many, many daguerreotypes there and spent much time there looking and thinking about how light falls on form. Here is their daguerreotype of the Boston Athenaeum, the second floor room. They were here frequently. They sold season tickets to their gallery, to the Board of Trustees of the Athenaeum, when they opened up their grand parlor stereoscope, their equivalent of big screen high definition TV, which they invented. And they featured in stereo this view of the reading room here on the second floor of the Boston Athenaeum, in which you cannot enter this building and not experience sculpture, and not experience the beauty of light on sculpture, and not experience the power and vitality that a sculpture has that no other form of image making has the equivalent of. It is this, I believe, and it's my theory, sitting in these environments in which not only the busts are sculpted, but the people are sculpted in light. And indeed, their business down the block in which they had their studio, they looked hard at sculpture in their studio, as well as here. And they borrowed from that sculpture, not only compositionally, but also in terms of the way light modeled form. This, I think, is pretty much proven here. For daguerreotypes, the stuff that isn't normally reproduced and isn't normally shown by Southworth and Hawes, in which they're copying not only a bust, but in the case here, a plaster cast of Nancy Hawes, Southworth's sister, in which they even made sculpture, evidently. So it's, of all things, sculpture. Here, this engraving of a bust of Edward Everett, and when Southworth chooses to depict himself here in this form here, what is it from? For years, since 1970, I've been hearing these foolish photo collectors saying, "Why has he got his shirt off?" When they see this, it's obvious why he has his shirt off, if you understand why that guy has his shirt off over there. This is a sculptural, classicizing depiction of the nobility of an individual in the traditions of American and, of course, classical sculpture. It's American sculpture. It's American sculpture in Boston. It's American sculpture in the Boston Athenaeum that is responsible, I believe, for some of the greatest aspects of the distinctive beauty of Southworth and Hawes. Now, I didn't just make that up to please you. But I think that's the first time you've heard it stated. But it's so clear. It's so clear, it's so understandable, particularly to this group in this room, that from hence on, I think the examination, certainly of Southworth and Hawes' work, but perhaps all of photography of the 19th century, needs to be looked at as we would look at sculpture. Certainly the influence is profound. In the words of Southworth and Hawes, I'll tell you, our past conduct and experience we offer to the public and to all as a pledge that we will excel. Our customers shall have the best work. We will deserve and claim by right the name of our establishment, the Artists' Daguerreotype Rooms. They claimed it, and they have the right to it. And it's clearer and clearer now than perhaps at any other time in the history of their production. Now, when you have this type of realization in photography, well, guys like me get excited. And when I came to Boston, I wanted to see, well, where did they do this? I have, since I was a boy, my father used to take me around and go, here was this, and there was that, and there's nothing there like what he's telling me about it, but I would see it and feel it. Here, George Washington slept. Right? Wow, George Washington, he slept. I never thought he slept. Had he slept here? That sort of thing that you tell to children, that has a big effect on their lives. It ruined mine. That's why I'm here now. So I came to Boston looking for Scollay Square. Now, Hawes stayed in the studio from 1843 to 1901. Now, Scollay Square went through a big transition, as did Boston. Boston grew. Scollay Square became more and more crowded. Hawes, in his letters, says so, that when I first came and looked out the building, I could still see gardens at the end of Bridal Street. And there were orchards in the back in Pemberton Square. And now there are thousands of people where there were just a dozen. Here at the turn of the century, just before probably the work that was started to put in the subway, Boston's first subway, it's one of its first stops was in Pemberton Square, Scollay Square. It took me a while to figure this out, what this is and stuff. But there's the studio buildings. It was still there at the end of the century. Hawes is still up here in the old rooms, but there are many more photographers, much more traffic, and a general drift to the honky-tonk. It got even more crowded. This is just about the time that they started to do the excavation for the subway. And indeed, it had lost its charm. It had lost its upscale tone. Here's after the subway was built, about 1905. Still, though, when you get out of the subway, you're fundamentally getting out in the same place. That is different. That the buildings still stand. And I was hoping that when I came to Boston with this, that I would find it. Well, it was turned into a Woolworth's. Now, Woolworths are gone, right? But when I was a boy, my grandmother, I remember taking me to the 5 and 10. It was a real big experience. And at one time, Woolworths was the first of those chain stores that we know. Southworth and Hawes' studio was turned into a Woolworths. Here is the room where Daniel Webster, Lola Montez, Louis Kossuth, Edward Everett, Emerson, Hawthorne, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Lemuel Shaw, right? All up here, 5 and 10 cent store now, right? Now, I started to look on the internet for, I wonder where the building is, and so I found this 1945 aerial view. Here's Brattle Street, Cornhill. The row is still there. The buildings are still there. It's at the end of Brattle Street. Here is the Southworth and Hawes building, but now there's a lot of automobile traffic. I stole this off the internet, why it has these purple lines. But here is the look of Scollay Square in the 1950s. Unfortunately, you can't see what's happening exactly here where the studio is. But it had really changed over time and changed into something else. Here in the 1950s, another view, and the buildings are gone. There is an amusement center, a penny arcade, where Daniel Webster and all these other people. The building next to it's still there, and in its profile, this was helpful in us understanding the height of the room. We knew the length and the depth and the height, but there you can see what the cross-section information is. That's the ghost of the building next to it. But I found on the internet another view of Boston, and the Boston of today, and I was greatly shocked and horrified that it had been altered. The government center, which you're all very well proud of and fond of, has replaced Brattle Street. And then I see this here row where Tremont Row was, this big arc, and I can't find Brattle Street so easy. Brattle Street was there here. Here's the courthouse where Pemberton Square was. And when I got to Boston here 2 years ago, on a very, very cold January, came down the end of Tremont Street. There's the entrance to Pemberton Square. Remember the map that I showed you that Hawes' son had drawn that showed? And there, I figured out, there is where it was, and after careful thinking and really squeezing, it's where the CVS Now, this is the footprint of time. You see, the Woolworth footprint is still there. CVS is the equivalent of Woolworth's, and it is still there. I went up to the building. The window... You can't make this up. My mouth fell open. Photo finish. Photo. We will never forget. Let Kodak capture your favorite moments. CVS Picture Place, where Daniel Webster and Southworth and Hawes. I went inside, and there's the picture place. It's a digital thing. And as I stood there with my mouth going lower and lower, a man came in with his little boy to have his portrait made. He held him up, and the young woman there took his digital picture. Where Daniel Webster? Virtually, a little higher up in the building. I came spinning out of that building when I saw this written in the snow, and so I could not resist. There is so much to say about Southworth and Hawes. There's so much yet to be discovered. But it is no question. This is super-duper national treasure. It's internationally important as well, but to the history of our nation, and certainly to the history of Boston, and to the history of this institution, and how it has played into the history of the city, the state, the nation, and the world. The connection of architecture, of sculpture, of culture, of photography, and in general just the business of memory, which is so well supported here and kept alive at this institution. There's few more special places on earth that I know of, and it's really been an honor to be given an opportunity to make the contribution this evening. Thank you very much. Go and have your picture made at CVS. I'll buy stock tomorrow in CVS. I don't know. Are there any questions? Perhaps 5 minutes of questions? Yes, sir.
Do you still hear the echo of Ben Franklin and John Adams in these men striving for perfection of contour?
Yes, I believe so. I believe so. Yes. The question was, do you still see the strivings and standard of like Benjamin Franklin in the work of these two men? I absolutely believe this is an American manifestation, just as Webster was a hero, a living Hercules in the culture. Benjamin Franklin and many other of the colonial figures were very much alive here. They made daguerreotypes of the paintings of Franklin and of Washington here at the Athenaeum. They looked down at Bridal Street Church, where the cannonball lodged in the wall from the bombardment to drive the British out. They really had a consciousness that they were in a special place. Boston was special. Where they were in Boston was special, and that they were part of a tradition. I think probably both families, the Hawes and Southworth, got off the Mayflower. You could probably track them down. This is no question that this is a fully American in the best spirit of it, in which that model of an earlier time, which wasn't that far removed from theirs. 50 years difference between the two? No, I think they had far more connection with that than is given to it. They saw, again, Emerson made a speech about young America, in which essentially he's saying also that the new world can take anything the old world has and make it better. This concept also was there, that somehow we had become, like Carlyle said, Yankeedom. Look what the Yankee Englishman, he says. We make better Englishmen here. Right? in that period. So yes, I do believe it's there. We have a lot of writing by Southworth, hardly anything by Hawes, and although we have a lot, we have really a very little. So we don't have their dialogues, their conversations. But if they came here, they were thinking about that. Anywhere they went in Boston, they were thinking about that. And I do think it really does figure into their achievement. Why I say this is national treasure. It's not beautiful photographs. It's national treasure. It's the best we could do. What else did we do that was so great in that period? Some nice architecture, some nice painting and sculpture. Some pretty good literature. Probably some pretty good locomotives and some pretty good sailing ships. And so this is a great period of inventiveness. It's when America got its reputation really in the world for its vitality, its ingenuity, its commercial genius. And of course, Boston was a great center of that. So this is part of that. Photographic history needs to be looked at as part of other history. It shouldn't be separated out and looked at as something in itself. It really is a disservice to what it is. And I do believe Southworth and Hawes would tell you that. Of course, they were constantly advocating, give us the attention we deserve it. We're part of this other thing too. But it's taken 160, 70 years for that to dawn on anybody, I think. But we're just at the beginning of it. When this work is 200 years old, when you look at these daguerreotypes as you look at the portraits of George Washington, there will be a different consciousness than there is today. And Daniel Webster will be far more alive in the minds of people 50 years from now than George Washington. And it's because you can see him. You can see him. You can believe in him. Had we daguerreotypes of George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, we'd think differently about them. Much, I don't know, better or worse, I'm not sure. Another question? Oh, I didn't expect.
You mentioned that the partnership dissolved.
Yes.
And Hawes stayed in Southworth.
Well, it dissolved in 1863. 1863, the Civil War was churning. The photographic business was it was economic decline because of the conditions of the war. People didn't have a lot of extra money to be blowing on high-end portraiture. I think economically the business was not viable for two, but Southworth remained an active photographer, although he doesn't seem to have had a studio. His father had died in that year, and he went back to manage the family farm, and for a while he did that. And then he became a pioneer in the use of photography in forensics, in legal arguments by comparison of signatures in cases where forgery was suspected. And he was an active figure in the photographic community as a member of the associations, the various different professional organizations. And in the 1880s, I began to talk reminiscently about the early days of photography. So both of them remained active in the photographic community up until the end of their lives. Someone else? Yes? Both operated the camera. In the first figuring out of their relationship, there was a tendency to see Southworth as the businessman and Hawes as the artist, which is a gross simplification. They say in their ads that nobody operates the camera but them, which is unusual for the bigger end studios. There were many other great studios in Boston. Whipple and Black and Massery and many other names. But for instance, Whipple had a fairly big operation eventually and wasn't always the cameraman. A couple of other people might work the camera. Southworth and Hawes claimed no one but them. And because in 1849, when the news of the gold rush hit Boston, Southworth left that month. And he was gone for 2 years gold mining in California. And we know that Hawes kept the studio going with Nancy and Southworth's brother, who took over some of the front business of receiving the sitters. So we know that Hawes could keep the studio going and kept the style going. But the writing of Southworth about the aesthetics of the daguerreotype and the applications of the daguerreotype are such that he couldn't make that up or learn that by looking over Hawes' shoulder. He was an active photographer. We do know he made some of the daguerreotypes in particular, and he was certainly a competent photographer and working after the studio separation. So they're both, and that's all the more remarkable, that they have a style. If you go to the exhibition, ask yourself, if this is the work of two men, which is the work of man A and which is the work of man B? And you can't figure that out. If you do, please call me and tell me what you see. And that's because of the technique that they developed. Because they were so much trying to avoid what they called sameness. In one of their ads, he says, there is no sameness in our work. Unlike other studios that were more cookie cutter, which made sense. Once you got a good spot, don't move out of that spot. Everybody sits down, goes like this, and has their picture made, and it's easier that way. They never made the same picture twice almost. And it's this moving around, finding the right spot for the sitter, and then moving around the sitter. There's one group of daguerreotypes there, 4 of Bowditch, in which you can see they're all 4 different. They move the camera up, down, left, right, and forward and back in the 4 exposures. That's hard work. It's because of that they made their achievement, but it was hard work. They did their study, they did their labor, they had their super high standard. Southworth says, aim high, and if you fall short of it, at least you'll fall higher than if you didn't. That old sort of advice. They took it seriously. I don't want to make everyone suffer. This is the moment where we can refresh ourselves, and I'm available should you wish to ask me a question. You can see I'll answer anything. Thank you.